Chapter 2. Making an Atlantic World. Section 4. Origins of the Slave Trade. Scholars continue to debate the structures of the Atlantic slave trade, which began during the 15th century and continued until the late 19th century. Across some 400 years, it is estimated that over 12 million black people were enslaved and deported to the Americas. Belonging to hundreds of different languages and cultures, most of the victims were sent to Brazil or the Caribbean. From a present-day North American perspective, it may be all too easy to forget that between 1500 and 1800, 3 Africans arrived in the Americas for every European. An unknown number of people were killed in Africa during the wars and raids caused by slaving. What is certain is that the Atlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on the peoples of Africa and the African diaspora in the Americas. The scale and scope of the Atlantic slave trade also varied considerably over time. Some African states refused to participate in the trade, while others, like Benin, did so for only a few decades. Ultimately, by commodifying human bodies, institutionalizing racism, and generating enormous fortunes, slavery utterly transformed the societies, cultures, and environments of the Atlantic world. Furthermore, the Atlantic traffic was, along with networks in the Indian Ocean, one of several long-distance slave trades that persisted across the early modern and modern eras. More recently, historians have looked at medieval prejudices, the price of sugar, and the demand for labor in the Mediterranean and Eastern Atlantic to locate the slave trade's origins. Having destroyed or assimilated the Guanche peoples of the Canaries, Portugal's would-be planters needed a new supply of workers to cultivate sugar, a labor-intensive crop. They first turned to the trade relationships that merchants had established with African city-states at the mouth of the Senegal and Gambia rivers. Since the 1440s, Portuguese sailors operating along the Senegambian coast in search of gold or a route to Asia had also kidnapped people to sell in southern Europe. Peasants provided the primary agricultural labor force in mainland Europe, so these African captives were valued primarily as domestic servants owned by elite families in Seville and Lisbon, which soon had a substantial African community, including free black Christians. With the development of sugar plantations on the archipelagos of the Eastern Atlantic, enslaved Africans soon became the primary workforce on these valuable islands. Because Africans both controlled the trade and were its victims, the relationship between anti-black racism and the slave trade has proved even more vexing. It is important to recognize that 16th century Africans, like their European contemporaries, did not act according to the ethnic, national, or racial identities that exist today. At the beginning of this slave trading system, African leaders sold war captives, who by custom forfeited their freedom if captured during battle, for Portuguese guns, iron, and manufactured goods. In these early exchanges, slavery was a byproduct of war, but slave-taking eventually became the reason for most conflicts. As the slave trade became increasingly lucrative, it ensnared more and more victims, including people who had fallen into debt or been accused of witchcraft. Observing the Senegambia slave trade during the 1500s, a Portuguese Jesuit remarked that, as long as witches are sold, they will be uncovered daily. 8 Europeans justified their actions by claiming that the people they enslaved would be rescued from paganism and converted to Christianity, a hypocrisy that was eventually normalized by the denial of black people's humanity and the entrenchment of racism. Profit was the driving force behind Atlantic slavery, and justifications were constantly contrived in the pursuit of wealth. In West Central Africa, the destructive relationship between war and slavery intensified during the 1560s when bands of nomadic warriors, known as the Jagas, invaded Congo from the east. Portuguese forces helped King Alvaro I fight off the invaders, but the price of their support was greater meddling in Congo's affairs. While Congolese kings had become increasingly wary of enmeshing themselves in the slave trade, the merchants of São Tomé insisted on a steady supply of war captives. With the crown's support in 1575, Paulo Dias de Nové began the first European attempt to conquer a region of mainland Africa in what became the colony of Angola. Proceeding from his base at Luanda, over the next decade, Novaes's forces marched up the Kwanza River, taking captives, making alliances, and building forts. When Novaes died in 1589, Portugal took control of the colony by sending royal governors and more troops. Serving short, 3-year terms in a deadly disease environment, Angola's governors wanted to get rich quickly, so they aligned themselves with the slavers of Brazil and São Tomé. After Portuguese forces sent from Brazil recaptured Angola from the Dutch, who seized much of Portugal's empire between the 1620s and 1640s, the two colonies strengthened their commercial and political ties, often beyond Lisbon's supervision. Having allied with the Dutch against their common enemy, Congo's rulers continued their efforts to oust the Portuguese. But in 1665, at the Battle of Mobila, the Portuguese and their Jaga allies defeated the royal army and killed King Antonio I. For the next century, Angola, Congo, and neighboring states descended into a series of civil wars that generated hundreds of thousands of captives for the sugar plantations of Brazil. 9. Section 5. Spanish Exploration and Conquests. As Portugal consolidated its access to Africa and Asia, Spain yearned for its own path to empire. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese captain who had studied under Portuguese navigators, promised that opportunity. Born in 1451, just a few years before Constantinople fell to the Ottomans and blocked the land route to China, Columbus was a typical member of Genoa's far-flung merchant cohort. He was married to the daughter of a Madeira planter and had worked in West Africa's gold and slave trade. An experienced mariner and avid reader, when he died in 1506, Columbus still believed that the Caribbean islands were part of an archipelago off the coast of Japan. Modern-day recognition of Columbus as the leading figure of a so-called Age of Discovery belies the very gradual, episodic, and fundamentally uncertain nature of European expansion between the 15th and 16th centuries. Columbus, like other educated Asians and Europeans of the 15th century, knew the world was round. So, while it was technically possible to reach Asia by sailing west from Europe, thereby avoiding Italian or Arab middlemen, the Earth's vast size would doom even the greatest caravels to starvation and thirst long before they reached their destination. In a critical but fortuitous miscalculation, Columbus underestimated the size of the globe by a full 2/3, and therefore believed it was possible. After unsuccessfully seeking support for his proposed expedition in several European courts, he convinced Isabel and Fernando of Spain to provide him with 3 ships, which set sail from the Canaries in 1492. Columbus was both confoundingly wrong about the size of the Earth and spectacularly lucky that a massive continent lurked in his path. After 2 months at sea, the 3 ships and their 90 men landed in the modern-day Bahamas. The Taínos, speakers of an Arawakan language, populated the largest Caribbean islands, what came to be called Hispaniola, today's Dominican Republic and Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. At their bustling towns, they traded, fished, and grew corn, yams, and cassava. The Taínos' rivals were the Kalinagos, also known as the Caribs, who inhabited the smaller islands of the eastern Caribbean. Over the preceding centuries, the Kalinagos had used their canoes and military prowess to create a trading and raiding zone that stretched from northern South America to the Lesser Antilles. Despite their impressive settlements and commercial networks, Columbus described the Taínos as childlike innocents. These people are very gentle, not knowing what is evil, nor the sins of murder or theft, he reported to the Spanish crown. I assure your highnesses that there is no better land nor people. They love their neighbors as themselves, and their speech is the sweetest and gentlest in the world, and always with a smile. By contrast, the Caribs, from which the word cannibal derives, were cast as ferocious savages, and thus legitimate targets for the Spanish invaders to kill or enslave. Despite his initial praise for Taino culture, Columbus had come for wealth, and at first, he found little. However, he noticed that some native elites wore small gold ornaments. This changed everything. When Columbus returned to Spain, he left a few dozen men on Hispaniola and ordered them to find and secure the source of the gold. He arrived at the Spanish court to great acclaim and quickly worked to outfit a return voyage. Building upon precedents established in the Canaries, Spain's strategies and motives were clear from the beginning. If outfitted for a return voyage, Columbus promised to procure gold and enslaved laborers, claiming that, with 50 men, the Indians can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. He was outfitted with 17 ships and over 1,000 men in what turned out to be the second of 4 voyages that he made to the Caribbean. As the gold supply ran out and previously friendly Taino leaders refused demands for tribute, the invaders embarked on a vicious campaign to extract every possible ounce of wealth from the Caribbean by enslaving its inhabitants. These captives were put to work in the gold fields or on the sugar plantations that eventually replaced them. Returning from his second voyage in 1496, Columbus's cargo included over 300 enslaved and branded Tainos, many of whom died on the way. The combination of new diseases and Spanish violence destroyed the Tainos within a few decades of contact. As news of Columbus's conquest spread back to Europe, ambitious Spaniards poured into the Americas seeking wealth and fame. Among them were members of the next generation of conquistadors, including Francisco Pizarro and Hernán Cortés, whose expeditions spread outward from bases in the Caribbean. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who fought alongside Cortés, described their motives succinctly. We came here to serve God and the king, and also to get rich. As Spain's overseas empire expanded, the next generation of conquistadors encountered the empires of Central and South America, which dwarfed the city-states of North America. The most powerful Maya city-states had collapsed before European arrival, likely because of droughts and unsustainable agricultural practices, but this decline was concurrent with the rise of another Native American empire, The Aztecs. Opportunistic migrants from distant lands to the north, the Mexicas, as the Aztecs called themselves, moved south into the Valley of Mexico and parlayed a series of alliances into control of an empire centered at Tenochtitlan. Founded in 1325, Tenochtitlan was an awe-inspiring city built on a series of natural and human-made islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Much of the city was fed by crops grown on large artificial islands called chinampas, which the Aztecs constructed by dredging rich sediment from the bottom of the lake and depositing it over time to form new landscapes. Tenochtitlan was also a holy city. A massive pyramid temple was located at the center and complemented by smaller temples and palaces. From their island city, the Aztecs controlled or influenced much of central and southern Mesoamerica. Allied with two other city-states, Aztec rulers governed through a decentralized network of subject peoples that paid regular tribute, including everything from the most basic items, such as corn, beans, and other foodstuffs, to luxury goods such as jade, cacao, and gold, and provided troops for the empire. Meanwhile, nearby kingdoms, including the Tarascans to the northwest and the remains of Maya city-states on the Yucatan Peninsula, chafed at Aztec power. Mesoamerica's political rivalries would play a decisive role in shaping events after Hernán Cortés, an ambitious notary who had won riches in the conquest of Cuba, organized an invasion of Mexico. Defying Cuba's governor, who hoped to lead the expedition himself, in 1519, Cortés landed 600 men on the coast and founded the town of Veracruz. Diplomacy, treachery, and alliance politics, not firearms or horses, were the real tools of the ensuing conquest. Relying on a native translator, whom he called Doña Marina and whom Mexican folklore denounces as La Malinche, Cortés gathered information and allies. Through intrigue, brutality, and the exploitation of political divisions, he enlisted native allies, defeated Spanish rivals, and marched on Tenochtitlan. Through persuasion, the Spaniards entered the capital peacefully. Cortés then took Emperor Montezuma hostage and used him to gain control of the empire's gold and silver reserves. Eventually, the Aztecs revolted, and Montezuma was killed. In a desperate retreat, mythologized by the survivors as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, the Spanish fought through thousands of indigenous soldiers and across canals to flee the city. Cortés and his lieutenants regrouped, recruited more native troops, captured Spanish reinforcements, and, in 1521, besieged Tenochtitlan. The 85-day siege cut off food and fresh water. As starvation set in, smallpox ravaged the inhabitants. One Spanish observer said it spread over the people as great destruction. Some had covered on all parts, their faces, their heads, their breasts, and so on. There was great havoc. Very many died of it. They could not move. They could not stir. The Spaniards and their allies then sacked the city. The temples were plundered, and 15,000 died. After 2 years of war and sickness, the combined forces of Habsburg Spain and its Mesoamerican allies had toppled the Aztecs and acquired great fortunes. Greater crimes would follow. Farther south, along the Andes Mountains, the Quechuas managed a vast empire, far larger and more powerful than that of the Aztecs. From their capital of Cusco in the Andean highlands, the Incas, as the Quechuan kings were called, used conquest and colonization to build an empire that stretched through the western half of South America, from present-day Ecuador to central Chile and Argentina. Generals, bureaucrats, and engineers were important functionaries in this far-flung domain with multiple provinces and active military frontiers. Terraces were cut into the sides of mountains to farm fertile soil, and by the 1400s, 1,000 miles of roads and bridges tied together perhaps 12 million people. Similar to the situation in Mesoamerica, unrest between the Incas and conquered groups created tensions and left the empire vulnerable to invaders. Carried along trade networks by human hosts, plagues spread in advance of the Spanish and hit the Inca Empire in 1525. Epidemics ravaged the population, cutting the empire's population in half and killing Emperor Huayna Capac and many members of his family. A bloody war of succession ensued between two half-brothers, Huascar and Atahualpa. It was into this dynastic chaos that Francisco Pizarro intervened after he landed a small force on the Pacific coast and marched inland. Pizarro drew from the same playbook as Cortés, for he relied heavily on deceit and native allies to seize power. Yet after executing Atahualpa and occupying Cusco in 1533, the conquest of the Inca Empire became a drawn-out affair that involved defeating armies led by Atahualpa's generals and a civil war between Spanish factions, each of which relied on mostly native troops. Pizarro was assassinated by his rivals in 1541, and a year later, his brother Gonzalo led a revolt that threatened to create an American kingdom separate from Spain. Gonzalo and the other leading rebels were eventually captured and executed, but it was only in 1572 that the last Inca who ruled an independent state in the jungles east of Peru was defeated.